Happy New Year, guys. We are into 2020, and today we're going to be counting down my top 10 favorite horror movies of 2019. I'm Zack and I started this channel because I'm a huge horror geek, and if you're like me, you might want to consider hitting that subscribe button and ringing the notification bell so you can stay up to date with all my horror movie shenanigans, including top 10s and rankings just like in this video. Coming in at number 10 is Ascape Room. It was kind of like a mishmash of the Saw movies and House on Haunted Hill. You have this group of strangers come together for a cash prize and then unwittingly find themselves trapped in a series of death rooms. You know, this is a popcorn flick. It's passable entertainment. I got exactly what I wanted to from what I understood from the premise. We weren't gonna get anything highly cerebral like a movie such as Cube, for instance. This movie just falls a little short for me because I feel like they didn't know how to properly wrap things up, and we got what seemed like 3 different endings, none of which were satisfactory enough. But it's still a decent movie to pop in on a Sunday afternoon if you got nothing better to do. Just a caveat before we move on to my next pick, this list is entirely my personal preference. I'm not the authority on what is and isn't the best horror movies. This is just entirely for fun. So if you disagree with me, then more power to you. Let me know in the comment section down below what your rankings would be. Be sure to give this a thumbs up as well. At number 9, I've got Brightburn. Now, this is a movie that is much better than it has any right to be. Essentially, it is Superman meets the Omen, and told as more of a what-if scenario if Superman had turned out to be a supervillain rather than a superhero. I think of this list, Brightburn is probably the nicest surprise for me. When this movie originally came out and I saw the trailers, I had no interest in seeing it, but I'm kind of glad that I did. This movie's also not afraid to hold back and kind of just goes for it. So there's quite a few shocking surprises. Aside from that, Brightburn also has some of the best gore effects I've seen in any horror movie this entire year. Coming in at number 8, I have Happy Death Day 2 You. Now, I really love the original. It pays homage to the slasher genre, but never oversteps its bounds. And when they announced the sequel, I wasn't really sure where they could go and how they could keep this fresh. But with this sequel, not only were they able to not be derivative of the first movie, they were able to switch things up by taking the horror elements and putting them on the back burner and making this more of a science fiction. But of course, at the core, these movies are more so a romantic comedy, and in terms of the laughs, it delivers in spades. Jessica Rothe is the standout in both of these movies, and her performance as Tree gives us one of the most refreshing and relatable final girls in recent history. If I had to pick out one bad thing about this movie, it's that it's not as focused as the original and comes off just a little bit lackluster because of that. There's a few holes in the story here and there, and a plot thread which is completely thrown out after the first act, and it does become a very glaring omission. However, it never really takes away the fun of this movie. At number 7, I have It Chapter 2. Now, I actually really enjoyed this movie. I skipped it in theaters because my response to the original was just kind of tepid, and I wasn't too keen on the 3-hour runtime. I should also point out that I don't really view Chapter 1 and Chapter 2 as 2 separate movies. I feel like they're both one really big movie on its own, so I'm not really comparing it to the first chapter. I thought the performances were excellent here. They did a really good job of casting actors who were believable as the grown-up version of the Losers Club. The balance of humor and horror works really well. I also wasn't too bothered by the infamous de-aging effects of the younger losers, just because the flashback aspects of the movie were some of my favorite parts. The only thing that's keeping this movie from being 3 or 4 spots higher on this list is the fact that there's so much unnecessary filler. At number 6, I have The Lighthouse. Now, I won't go on too much about this one because I did do a separate review of it. This is a very pretentious art house film, and I know that it probably rubs a lot of people the wrong way. When I rank movies, I don't just look at specific aspects like the story. The production value is just as important, if not even more essential, to the overall quality of the movie. This is definitely a movie that is style over substance. We can see it with the amazing sound design and the look of the film with its square aspect ratio. You also get 2 incredible performances from both Willem Dafoe and Robert Pattinson. I just find the whole thing to be a very artistic descent into madness. At number 5, I have Crawl. Now, this is another one that I missed in the theater and didn't watch until this past month, and it was one that I was anticipating a lot because I had heard a lot of buzz about it. This movie definitely lends true to the saying that less is more. You have a very small scale story with primarily just 2 characters. What I like about this movie is that the threat level is is multi-layered. On one hand, you have the alligators, but on the other hand, you have the hurricane that is brewing outside and is slowly flooding this cellar, which these characters are trapped in. So it puts a lot of emphasis on how little time there is. Because of that, there are no wasted scenes, there's no filler. Every beat to the movie is necessary for moving the story along. I also get a very Resident Evil video game vibe from this movie. Every room or space that the characters need to move, or in this case crawl into, there's always a different, very dramatic and cinematic camera angle. This cinematography adds a lot of dimension to a small shooting space that would have otherwise come off as being very bland, considering we spend most of the movie in it. Some of the dialogue here is a little hokey, but given the situation that the characters are in, you do feel very emotionally connected with them the whole time. At number 4, I have Ready or Not. This is some of the most fun I've had at the cinema all year. This movie does have a lot of Your Next vibes, but it mostly comes off as a very lighthearted version of that. This is, for all intents and purposes, a comedy after all, but of course with a lot of horrific elements added to the mix. I love the lighting and set design here. It lends to a very overall gothic vibe to the movie. The cast of characters is also phenomenal, from Samira Weaving to Henry Czerny, Andy McDowell, and Adam Brody. Everyone here is so much fun to watch, and you can tell that they had a really great time making this movie as well. And while I love the character of Grace, my only gripe about this movie is that she doesn't seem to have any agency. She never seems to be in control of her story throughout any point of the movie, which is a little disappointing to me because when you look at the poster art for this movie, you can see her all decked out with all this weaponry, so you really think that she's going to rise to the occasion and fight back to save her life, much like Erin in Your Next. But throughout the runtime, she doesn't really do much of anything. It's mostly the family that we get to see have these character moments, which end up steering the story in different directions, and sometimes it doesn't exactly make sense within the context of the rest of the movie, and it's just more so there to service the plot moving forward. And while all this is happening, Grace is sort of just a passenger along the ride. Regardless of that, this movie is still highly entertaining, and I absolutely adore it. At number 3, we have Us. Now, I did ask people on my Instagram account what their favorite horror movie was of 2019, and the consensus was that it was Us. There was a lot of anticipation to see what Jordan Peele's follow-up to Get Out would be. And while I don't think that Us is a better movie than Get Out, it is still absolutely amazing. Now, I know a lot of people take issues with the plot holes and the story not making a whole lot of sense, but honestly, I don't think it really needs to. I hope I don't piss anyone off by saying this, but I think that Jordan Peele is well on his way to becoming the next Wes Craven. And he's probably one of the few people that's at the forefront of this renaissance of horror that we're currently in. Even if you look back at Wes Craven's second movie, you know, he was very popular at the time, but he still hadn't made his Nightmare on Elm Street or Scream yet. So I think that the best things for Jordan Peele have yet to come. He has such a great appreciation and understanding for the horror genre going way back to the earliest days of cinema. And also, not to mention the level of skill here, he's directing 4 actors to play 2 characters each, and not to undercut the performances of the actors themselves who are playing the nuances of 2 separate characters in one. It's just a great movie, and I love the music in it as well. I really don't see any reason why it shouldn't be number 1, other than the fact that there are 2 movies that came out last year that I like even more than this. So at number 2, I have Dr. Sleep. Now, Mike Flanagan had the unenviable task of not only making a sequel 40 years later to one of the greatest horror movies ever, but also making an adaptation of the Stephen King novel and taking these 2 separate stories, both with conflicting narratives, and then meshing them together in one cohesive structure. And for all intents and purposes, he hit this one out of the park. This movie is beautiful. The way that it's shot is almost dreamlike, how each scene sort of fades in and out, and you're not really sure where it ends and where it begins. This is 2.5 hours long, and at no point did I ever feel the runtime. The vibe here also feels more Stephen King than I felt in any adaptation of his in the last 20 years. The performances in this movie are great, especially the young girl who plays Abra, who's one of the most talented child actors I've seen in a movie in as long as I can remember. The music here is phenomenal as well. It pays homage to the original soundtrack while also adding its own flourishes. This entry definitely stands strongly on its own without relying heavily on the original. If I had just one minor gripe, it's that the villains in this movie never really feel like they're a formidable foe. They're definitely captivating to watch, but I never get the sense that our heroes are in any major sort of danger. Dr. Sleep is not a perfect movie, but it lived up to my expectations and far exceeded them as well. So when I did my video for my favorite horror movie of every year that I've been alive, I kind of stopped short at 2018 as I hadn't figured out yet what my favorite horror movie was of 2019. Well, I've caught up on as many horror movies as I could, and I now have a winner. At number 1, we have Midsommar. I know that this is a movie that is very divisive amongst people. If you love it, you absolutely love it, and if you hate it, you absolutely hate it. What I love about this movie is that this kind of horror is the most palpable to me. It's so subtle and underneath the surface that you can't tell that it's really horror until it's actually happening. And for the most part, if anyone's ever experienced a major trauma or been through any sort of real life horror, that's how it goes. You don't really know that you're in it until you're in it. The violence and gory aspects of this movie are not held back here either. We get a scene probably a third to halfway through that is one of the most graphic I've seen in a long time, and it's probably one of the most realistic depictions of violence I've seen in cinema as well. I would almost be disgusted and offended by how long they linger on this violence as well, except for the fact that it's so artfully done that you can't help but admire the beauty of it. The entire aesthetic of this movie as well is just so incredible. It's almost like the Instagram account of an influencer being murdered in every new post. This is the kind of movie that sticks with me. It makes me think about it long after I've seen it, and it makes me want to go back and watch it again and again to see all the things that I missed and the clues that were laden about that kind of build up to the grand finale. I'm really excited for 2020. I think that there's going to be a lot of great horror movies this year. 2019 was a little bit lackluster, but the movies that were good were great. If you missed it, you can check out my video for the 10 worst horror movies of 2019 up in this corner. Thank you so much for watching, guys. I've been Zack Cherry, and I'll be right back.